What's up, degenerates? Me, AAA, back again. Hope you're all having a good start to 2017, wrapping up warm for January. And if you're in a place where you don't need to wrap up this time of year, I'm envious because it's bloody cold here in England. But I digress. Today, we're handling a vid by everyone's favourite cute Asian American femtard, Marina Shut Up. Which video, you ask? Her informal rant on why Game of Thrones is racist, which should be fun, eh? Now, I came across this video due to a vid by some black guy. If you're not subbed already and don't know who he is, check out the links in the description. There's a link to the video and his channel. He makes awesome content, down to earth, genuine and intelligent guy. So, let's dive in, shall we?
Hey friends, so I kind of just wanted to sit here and talk at you a little bit.
Now, she waffles on for about 3 minutes about how bad she has it and how it's all everyone else's fault. Here's just a highlight.
I feel like it's a particularly millennial thing to move back in with your parents after college, but also maybe we wouldn't have to if baby boomers didn't fuck up the economy and make things really hard for, college kids who are just trying to get an education without procuring massive amounts of debt. But that's just a whole other discussion that I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about.
So, the fact you have no other income than your YouTube channel and have to move in with your parents is the previous generation's fault. It's nothing to do with the fact that you majored in gender studies, a subject that has zero practical application or real-world worth other than pissing and moaning on the internet about smashing the patriarchy.
You want to smash the patriarchy right in the face? Alright, so on to the actually semi-substantial part of this video. I wanted to talk about Game of Thrones. I don't know if I've ever talked about Game of Thrones on this channel, which is weird because I minored in communications and I used to study English Lit. So talking about media and analyzing it critically is kind of my jam. I know I'm gonna get a lot of YouTube trolls telling me that it doesn't matter, it's just a show, blah 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 blah, but I think it would be foolish to think that the media that we consume, especially media as popular as Game of Thrones, where a large segment of the population is internalizing it and consuming it, I think it would be foolish to say that it doesn't affect us in some way.
The problem I have with this train of thought is that it's used to replace personal responsibility. Media does not define a person. A person does not become a Nazi overnight because they read Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf is just a book. It's what the person reading decides to make out of it that decides the outcome. Now, when I was younger, there was a case of two young boys who kidnapped and murdered a toddler in 1993. I only mention this because it's a perfect example of the idiocy of the agenda being pushed here. At the time, people were in such disbelief that children could be disturbed enough to commit such a heinous act that they looked to the media the two boys were exposed to, resulting in a shitstorm surrounding the Chucky movie franchise. The focus being that Chucky 3 specifically was the cause of the event, and not the fact that these were two very disturbed young boys. I remember at the time thinking to myself, I've seen Chucky and it didn't make me want to go and do these things, as probably many young people at the time did. Then moving on from there, the religious right attack on violent video games. While I'll concede, violent video games do desensitize children to violence, they don't cause it. Let me know what you think in the comments. Enough on that tangent, let's get back to the video.
I find that whenever I talk about representation, I get lots of people saying that representation doesn't matter, why are you worrying about this, etc, etc. And I also find that typically, not always, but typically, the people saying things like this are widely represented in society.
Now, I can understand worrying about representation in a program or show with a modern setting, like, say, an office drama. But to say representation matters in something like a period drama is ridiculous. You wouldn't watch Vikings and say, well, there's not enough black people in it. Unless you are completely retarded. Because it's about fucking Vikings. And in my opinion, whitewashing is just as ridiculous. Yes, Hollywood, we did notice that all the gods of Egypt were white.
But what I realized the other day is that there are more major characters in Game of Thrones that have red hair than there are black or Asian characters. And in case you were wondering, the population of black and Asian people in the entire world is much larger than the population of redheads. I think redheads are only like 2% of the population, so very insignificant, yet somehow they dominate a lot of Game of Thrones, but I've also seen it in a lot of other like fiction. Harry Potter, the Weasleys are an entire family of redheads, which I think is just genetically impossible. It's a recessive trait, and I don't really give a fuck about the accuracy of redhead representation. I'm more concerned about the lack of representation of people of color in fantasy just in general.
Now here she shows a great lack of knowledge, and the point that prompted me to make this video in the first place. Ginger hair, while recessive, is actually a hereditary trait. So if a mother and father are both ginger, then it's more than likely that their children will be ginger too. And also she shows the bigoted double standard that she holds. She doesn't give a fuck about ginger representation, but she gives a fuck about the representation of people of colour. Now surely the whole point in representation is to make sure that everyone is represented equally.
And that's not to say that there are zero people of color in fantasy or there's no people of color writing fantasy. I think Ursula Le Guin is a great example of this. I'm not disputing that there aren't important characters of color or authors of color who are making great contributions to the realm of fantasy.
And here we have the obligatory name drop and virtue signal whilst segregating by race. Who gives a fuck? I mean, really, who cares what colour the person is writing the story?
I don't give a fuck!
Surely the main focus should be the story itself. If you enjoy the story and can engross yourself in it, then who the fuck cares what colour the author is?
I don't give a fuck!
There's only one type of person who actually gives a shit about the race of an author.
That's racist! I love Game of Thrones. I've read the first 2 books, but if you're familiar with the Game of Thrones books, they're like 1,000 pages per book. So a little bit hard to get through all of it. One day when I have more time, I'll definitely do that.
Yeah, I somehow doubt it, because it seems like you've already resolved that George R.R. Martin is a racist for not putting enough black people in a period piece mostly set in medieval England, where there were no black people. You can make time to read tripe like Eduardo Bonella Silva's Racism Without Racist and regurgitate it into a video. Yet you want us to believe that you don't have time to read Game of Thrones. Really?
So when I did post on social media yesterday about Game of Thrones having more major characters with red hair than there were black people on the entire show, definitely pissed off some nerd boys.
And what a surprise, we have the famous feminist derogatory pigeonholing. Anyone who disagrees with her opinion on media is a fanboy, on race is a racist, on feminism is a misogynist, on politics is a Nazi, and on trans issues is transphobic. This is, in my opinion, why the large majority of feminist and SJW types are so detached from reality. Their inability to interact with people with other viewpoints and opinions limits them to a black and white view of the world.
One of the main arguments I received is that Westeros, which is the main region in Game of Thrones that is explored, but it does occasionally diverge from that, is based on medieval Europe.
It's actually not based on medieval Europe, but specifically on medieval England. I could sit and reel off the similarities all day, but I will stick to just one large direct similarity to prove my point. The Wall, which anyone with an understanding of British history can tell you that is quite obviously based around Hadrian's Wall, built by the Romans in the early AD 100s to keep out the savage Scottish clans. Sound familiar? So bearing in mind this is set in Middle Ages England for the most part, and for argument's sake we'll completely disregard parts that draw similarities to the Mediterranean, as Marina has, if you look at the time period, there were no black people around at all. None. You could argue that it's fantasy and they could make anyone anything, but my counter to this would be that the inherent realism is the major appeal of Game of Thrones. George R.R. Martin breaks away from the tropes and the fantasy norms to bring nuance and depth to characters and situations. There's no mustache twirling bad guy or holier than thou hero who overcomes all obstacles, because everybody knows that in real life this would be the guy who ends up with a knife between the ribs whilst he's monologuing. And let me clarify before someone says, how can you say it's realistic? Dragons and ice zombies and magic and shit. I'm talking about the characters and personal situations specifically. Each character is well fleshed out, believable and relatable. You could easily see any one of the characters as an actual person. Anyway, I think I've prattled on for long enough. As always, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Check the links in the description. There's a couple of sources if you're interested in the genetics behind ginger hair. There's one about ginger beards I found interesting, so I thought I'd share it with you guys. There's also a link for anyone who's interested in learning a little bit more about Hadrian's Wall, and the links to some black guy's channel and video. Go show him some love. Like, subscribe, share, all that good shit. Check the Twitter, the Patreon. I'm thinking of doing some exclusive content and maybe some outtakes or something like that. Let me know if that's something you guys would want to see. And on that note, I'm out. Peace.
Check your privilege, check your